everybody. Today we will be going to discuss feminist theory or feminist sociology. Specifically, I will be focusing on development of feminism or the historical evolution of feminism as an ideology or as a social movement. So, first of all, let us try to understand what are the basic standpoints of feminist theory, or what is the basic assumptions of feminist theory. It's a generalized, wide-ranging system of ideas about social life and human experience developed from a women-centered perspective. Women-centered in two ways. Basically, feminist theory is women-centered in two ways. The first is, of course, the starting point is the situations and experiences of women in society. And the another point is that it seeks to describe and critically evaluate the world from the distinctive or vantage points of women. Now, feminism, as I have already mentioned, that it is a social movement as well as an ideology. Feminism is always in support of the idea that a larger share of scarce resources, for example, wealth, power, income, and status, should be distributed to women. Gender differences, as believes the feminist scholars, that gender differences are a result of historically created social conditions, not the result of natural biological differences. So that is the crucial point we want to make when we are going through feminist scholarship, that gender differences are socially constructed. It is not something biologically given or naturally given. Feminists fight for the equality of women. Now, what about sociology? The sociology we know, according to the feminist scholars, that is typically male stream. It is male stream because it is concerned with research on men. I mean, the mainstream sociology is termed to be male stream sociology by the feminist critics. Why? Because they believe, I mean the feminist scholars believe, that male stream sociology is concerned with research on men, use theories and concepts applicable primarily to men's lives. Its research findings are often based on all male samples and are generalized to the whole population. Women's issues are either overlooked or regarded to be unimportant. If the women issues are often included or at times included in research, they are presented in distorted and stereotypical way. Sex and gender issues are just added on. It has got no, typical significance. It is just added on. Male domination either ignored or seen to be natural. Male domination is obvious or natural. So, in this way, the feminist critics or the feminist scholars, they term mainstream sociology to be the male stream sociology. Now, we are going to trace the historical development of feminism. Basically, it has moved from the middle 19th century to the contemporary period, and we can trace broadly three waves or three phases of feminism. The first wave started with 19th century and it continued to early 20th century. The second wave began with early 1960s and continued through the late 1980s. The third wave is still continuing. It began with early 1990s. Now, let us try to understand the typical characteristics of the first wave feminism. The first wave feminism, as I have already mentioned, that it started with mid-19th century. It attempts to gain equal rights for women, especially in education, voting and property. Seneca Falls Convention took place in 1848. That is regarded to be the launching of the feminist movement in world. That Seneca Falls Convention, that was the first women's rights convention. In this convention, more than 300 people attended. A group of women led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton spearheaded the convention. Now, Seneca Falls in New York is the birthplace of American feminism. So, the convention, the Seneca Falls Convention believes that many social institutions were designed to keep women subordinate to men, and the existing socio-political structure always worked against women. So how, the convention trace or portray the reality of social institutions and socio-political structure. The convention declares that once a woman married, or it is the conviction of the convention that once a woman married, she forfeited her legal existence. She couldn't sign a contract, make a will, or sue in any court of law. If she received property from the father, if we take it for granted that any woman received property from her father or some other sources, her husband could easily sell it and keep the money for himself. So that is the reality of the social and the familial institutions as the convention believes. Now, the convention came out with a declaration. Historically, it is known to be the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the first draft of this sentiment, and in that sentiment, or the Declaration of Sentiments, Stanton declared that men and women are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Men have framed the laws of divorce. They have also, identified the proper cause of divorce, the issue of guardianship of children in case of separation. So it is all male affair, as the Declaration of Sentiments declares. Now, men have also monopolized all profitable employments, opportunities for education, and of course the profitable occupations and any other better life chances of the male of the society. They are always appropriated by the males. So, what are the achievements of first wave feminism? In 1920, women gained right to vote in USA. That was the first achievement of the first wave feminism, and USA was the 17th country to do so, while the first was New Zealand. The women in New Zealand achieved voting rights in the year 1893, and in USA it was in 1920. And for India, the Indian women had to wait till after independence, in the year 1951-52, in the first general election of independent India, the women got universal adult franchise. So the voting right of the women in India is relatively new compared to other nations. Now, I will try to look at the trends of or some continuation of the first wave feminist thinking, first wave feminist movements in the early 20th century. So we can look at Germany, feminist movement in Germany. In 1905, in Germany, movement for sexual autonomy, known as the erotic movement, started, and its leader was Helen Stoker. Now, this erotic movement fought for the right of women to engage in sexual relations, regardless of marital and legal consideration. So that is the continuation of the first wave feminist thinking, that they believe that the social institutions, they breed inequality. So they fought for the right of women so that they can engage in sexual relations without considering about the marital and legal kind of dimensions. Now, the scholarship, sociological scholarship, they criticize this erotic movement. The first one is the classical sociological thinker Max Weber. He believed that this movement promotes free love and illegitimate children, so it is highly unethical. And next comes Marion Weber, wife of Max Weber. According to her, focus of women's movement should be equality of women, not sexual emancipation. She argues, rather, that marriage is a lasting relationship between man and women. From this, she made two critical points. First, women to be treated equally in the institution of marriage and other institutions. That is the claim of the first wave feminist also, that equality of women in the institutions, of the sphere of institutions. Now, marriage, according to Marion Weber, is strictly a union between a man and a woman. Although lesbian feminists, they might disagree with this point, that marriage is strictly a union between a man and a woman. Such heterosexual concept of marriage, often the lesbian feminists disagree with it. Now the second wave, it started with 1960s and continued through the late 1980s. While the first wave the emphasis was on equal rights. The second wave differed from the first wave in that its emphasis is on women's liberation. So from equal rights, now the movement is moving into the terrain of women's liberation. And for this, the second wave feminism, it started to generate consciousness about the worldly sisterhood of women, and they turned this as consciousness raising that tries to develop a shared consciousness of oppression among women. That is, the oppression brings all the women of the world together. So this sort of consciousness raising was the task the second wave feminists set before them. Now they also declared, the second wave feminists or the second wave feminist movement, it declared that the personal is always political. And from this standpoint, they came to the point that patriarchal systems of power must be overthrown to achieve liberation. So the target is to liberate women, and for that reason, patriarchal or the patriarchal system of domination should be overthrown. Because maintaining patriarchy, keeping intact patriarchy, equal rights cannot be achieved. So the second wave, they came down heavily on the patriarchal system of power, and they tried to overthrow or they aimed to overthrow patriarchal system of power. Now why the personal is political? Carol Hanist in 1970 wrote a paper. Its title was "The Personal is Political," and Hanist was an activist, second wave feminist activist. She wrote the paper in 1970. The title was "The Personal is Political." Now, how she traced the personal to be political? She explained that women's relationships, their roles in marriage, and their feelings about childbearing are relegated to the personal sphere. So these are the personal spheres. Their role in marriage, their relationships, their feelings about childbearing, these are typically women's issues. So they are relegated to the personal sphere. Now, nobody can deny that these are the spheres where women face the worst form of patriarchal gender discrimination. So these are the spheres where patriarchy oppresses the women, and it is relegated to the personal sphere, so that no discussion in the private, in the public sphere is allowed about all this. Even the women, they also feel that these are their typical domain, and these are not to be discussed in public sphere or in public space. But as much as patriarchy is there, patriarchy penetrates this personal sphere also. So these are by no means any sort of, personal kind of domains of the women. So essentially here is a power play. Now women's personal experiences thus have important link to the patriarchal power relations. In that way, the personal is always political. So the personal or the private is always political. It cannot be relegated to the typical womanly issues or women's domain, so that it is personal. It is not personal, as patriarchal power relations is at play. So it is always a political issue. And second wave feminists, they are always in the position that this way the women's problem should be addressed. Often it is attempted. Often there is a kind of effort from the patriarchal point of view to make womenly issues personal issues of the women. But we must keep in mind, as the second wave feminists believe, that in typically women's issues such as childbearing or marriage or women relationships, there is always the penetration of patriarchy. So as patriarchy is there, so patriarchal power relations are there. So it is never a personal issue of the women, it is always a political issue. Now, the second wave, let us move to the context of the second wave feminist movement. In America, second wave feminism arose out of the civil rights and anti-war movements. And anti-war movements means this is typically anti-Vietnamese war movement, and civil rights movement means the movement for the equality of races in America. Now women, the participants of these movements, the women disillusioned with their second class status, even in the activist environment. Activist environment means they were in the movement, and as they were involved in the movement, so they were also activists in the movement. but they got disillusioned with this activism environment of student politics, and so and of course the civil rights movement and anti-war movements. So they tried to band together. So they tried to associate among themselves to contend against discrimination. So all these movements against one form of exploitation. Say, if we try to look at the civil rights movement, it was movement against the racial domination of the whites against the blacks. And anti-war movement means it is typically a movement against US imperialism. So in that movement situation also, women felt that they were relegated to the second class position. So they tried to band together, they tried to form association of themselves to protest against this sort of thing. Now, what are the tactics they employed? The second wave feminism is quite famous for its protest against the Miss America Beauty Contest in 1968. Why they protested against the Miss America Beauty Contest? First, it believes that judging of women according to conventional male-decided standards of femininity. So it is not femininity according or a sort of universal marker of femininity. It is a sort of femininity that the benchmark or the dimensions are fixed by the males. So it is male-decided or male-determined standards of femininity. So that is not at all as femininity that the second wave believes. So the second wave protests against the Miss America Beauty Contest because it judges beauty according to a male standard, and it of course leads to the objectification of women. As the male are the deciders of femininity, so it leads towards objectification of women, because it is not the women, they are judging the women, it is the males, they are in the role of judgment. So as they are judging it according to their standards, so it leads to the objectification of women. Now, the second tactics they applied, the first one was to protest against the beauty contest in America, and the second tactics they employed was to raise small consciousness raising groups, so that small groups, small associations, there will be kind of effort to raise the consciousness that as women everywhere, all the women are oppressed, and the main target is to overthrow patriarchy. Until and unless patriarchy is overthrown, the cause of women's liberation cannot be achieved. So this sort of consciousness can be raised in small groups. So they tried to form small groups, so where this sort of discussion, this sort of culture can be cultivated. Now, who were the major proponents of this second wave feminism? First one, Simone de Beauvoir. Her famous work or her famous book was The Second Sex, written in 1949. And the second one is yet another famous work by Betty Friedan, and the name of the book is The Feminine Mystique. It was published in 1963. In fact, it has become a canonical kind of work as far as feminist movement is concerned. And the third one is Kate Millett. It's a Sexual Politics, her famous work, famous book. It came out in 1970. So what were the issues addressed by second wave feminists? First, they tried to look at the issues of unofficial, I mean de facto inequalities. The inequalities which are unofficial, which are not at the surface level, but they are very much present in social relations, in social life. So these sort of unofficial de facto inequalities and these sort of inequalities, they strongly or heavily addressed. Of course, official legal inequalities are there, and these are seen, this can be seen, this can be revealed. So along with official legal inequalities, they also, more importantly perhaps, tried to address the issues of unofficial inequalities, and then they pick up the issue of sexual and economic exploitation in the sphere of family, in the sphere of workplace, and of course violence against women. Violence against women is a typical issue, and I think it is large enough to cover the globe also. In no society the women are quite free from it. So violence against women is yet another important issue which the second wave feminists tried to address, And of course reproductive rights. That is a very important, important phenomenon, important domain, or important yardmark or benchmark of freedom for the women. So they fought for reproductive rights of the women. Now we are moving to our last portion, and we will be steadily entering into the third wave as it is continuing till date. It has started with the year, in the period 1990s, early 1990s, and it is continuing till date. Now, third wave feminism challenges the second wave's essentialist definition of femininity. Essentialist means that it often assumes a universal female identity. Female identity, it's a sort of universal identity. All the females are equal everywhere in the world. So that sort of universalization of female identity is there. So third wave feminism or third wave feminists, they challenge this essentialist, universalized notion of femininity as posed by the second wave. Now, overemphasizes, second wave feminism, it overemphasizes experiences of upper middle class white women. So these upper middle class white women's experiences are generalized for all classes, all segments of women. So they challenge the belief of the second wave feminists that women does not simply mean, or women's experience cannot only be equated with the experiences of the upper middle class white women. And these upper middle class white women, as the third wave feminists, they alleges the second wave feminists, that they try to generalize the experiences of the upper class, middle class white women's experiences as the experiences of the women. So what the third wave feminists believe? They believe that women are of many colors. Of many races. They are of many ethnicities. So there are differences. They are of many nationalities. They are of many religions, and they come from different cultural backgrounds. So women's experiences cannot be generalized. Women are of multi-dimensional kind of social background, cultural background, racial background. So women's experiences cannot be generalized, it cannot be universalized also, as the second wave feminists tried to do. So the third wave feminists believe that there cannot be any all-encompassing single feminist idea. There may be different situations, so different meanings of feminism, different perceptions of feminist movement. They also believe that men and women are different and unique in their own ways. So men and women are fundamentally different and they are unique in their own ways. And these differences have to be respected. This is the point which brings third wave feminists close to the idea of postmodernism. That these differences have to be respected, and these differences should not translate into differential treatment. That there are differences, that doesn't mean that there should be inequality. So these differences should not be translated into differential treatment of men and women and unequal opportunities for women. So difference doesn't naturally imply inequality. Now, what is the importance of third wave feminists? Third wave feminist movement. First, it tries to reclaim femininity. Second, it tries to celebrate sexuality in all of its forms and dimensions. Homosexuality as good as heterosexuality. And sexuality has a positive aspect in life. Now, a strong and deliberate assertion of female sexuality. Third wave feminists tried to make a very strong and deliberate assertion of female sexuality. And as for example, we can mention about the female pop groups like Spice Girls and Pussycat Dolls that portray women not as passive sexual objects but as active ones. So this is the kind of celebration of women's sexuality, and that makes third wave feminists quite different from the earlier waves. Now, naturally it leads towards growing recognition of lesbianism. And if you continue with the importance of third wave feminism, it arrives at the consideration of second wave's opposition towards pornography and sex work. Second wave tried to believed that pornography and sex work is highly degrading, and it's the site of tremendous inequality or sexual oppression of women. But the third wave feminists, they tried to reconsider this second wave's opposition toward pornography and sex work, and they believe that the participants in pornography and sex workers can be empowered. So this is also yet another important distinction, difference between the third wave feminists and the second wave feminists. Now, clearly, it is the influence of postmodernism and queer theory. We can find these influences on third wave feminism since they celebrate differences, since they celebrate human sexuality, since they try to empower the participants of the pornography and different forms of sex work. Now, major proponents of third wave feminism is Rebecca Walker. The second major proponent was Jennifer Baumgartner, and the third major proponent of third wave feminism is Annie Richards. And that's all for today. Thank you.